Alright, this is going to be a short presentation, and then we're going to do kind of a line-by-line analysis of some code, which will be a little thick, so we'll try to take our time. And then we have an exercise that's directly related. So, the marquee element. I bet you didn't think you were going to learn about how to make marquees, but you are. So, let's start. Blink. Blink is what we call the layout engine for Chrome. It was forked from a part of WebKit. So if you hear WebKit, Chrome used to be directly WebKit, but it forked Blink. So it's based on WebKit, part of WebKit. Blink is the layout engine for Chrome. That's not to be confused with V8, which is the JavaScript engine. This is layout engine, so think HTML, think browser, think elements. It's also for Opera as well. Oh, recently there was this, or a little while back, there was this project called Blink in JavaScript for the Chromium projects. And I thought this was a really interesting project, and it was this idea that we could, so normally elements in the browser, like when we think of something like h1 or input or div, they're implemented in C++. But C++ is hard to maintain. No one wants to write C++. Well, that's not true, but.
Wait,
what was that?
Elements in HTML are implemented in C++?
Yes, so the implementation, like the under-the-hood mechanics of these elements in the browser are implemented in C++ in Blink. But the theory of this project, or this experiment at least, was that C++ is hard to maintain and it has some security risks when working with it in this context. And so the theory of this project, Blink in JS, proposed that we write these elements we write some of these elements in JavaScript. So that's just the premise. Don't worry about it too much. This is kind of an experiment. It was an interesting thing to do. And the interesting thing to do was to implement high-level DOM features, the DOM being the elements in the browser, in JavaScript. And they note in their presentation, in the Blink.js presentation, these are mostly quotes from their slides, that the goal is maintainability, security, and layering, not performance or power of memory. So this is not like changing how the browser is written. We're not going to suddenly write all our JavaScript elements, or all our DOM elements with JavaScript under the hood. Oops. But the point that I'm trying to get to here is that they decided to experiment with this. They were going to implement the marquee element in HTML in JavaScript in Blink. And this was the really kind of interesting part of it. And so, how many have used marquee before? Don't be proud of that. Don't admit it.
We have to admit it.
Don't admit it. No. So, marquee, this is around the end. It was a real element. It's non-standard. That's what this big red box is telling you. The big red box is saying, please never use this ever. So, don't take any of this as we should go out and use the marquee element. The point here is to see how it was implemented for an experiment only. But this is the experiment. So this link, if you have it, pull it up. The point I'm bringing up with the marquee element of Blink in JS is that what we got was in the Chrome core, we have an example of an element, an HTML element that would ordinarily have been written in C++, written entirely in JavaScript. This looks like JavaScript. At the top, it says JavaScript. HTML marquee element, JavaScript, in Chromium Blink. And so what we're going to do now is go through this element. What I think is really interesting, and I think when we look through this code, there's a lot of stuff here, but I think when we look through this code, one, we should be able to understand what's going on, because it is JavaScript. But two, I think what you'll start to see is this looks an awful lot like a custom element. This looks an awful lot like a web component. And that makes sense, I think, right? Because custom elements are real DOM elements. We've been saying that kind of repeatedly throughout the week. But I think it helps to actually see that this is how, when given the opportunity to do it in JavaScript, this is how, the browser can actually implement its own element. So this is sort of an experiment to go through and look what this is like. So I'm going to zoom in here because there's a lot of code. We're not going to go through all the code. But we'll look through some of it. So let's see, we have a function called install class. I don't know what that means, but it sort of looks like it's registering the name of this element here. Not the name of the actual element, but the name of the class, the name of that base element, base prototype. Set some default stuff, some default behaviors. See if we can get to something interesting here. Ah, I see something interesting. Does anybody notice it?
Callback.
Yeah, created callback. We've seen that before, haven't we? What else do we have there? Create shadow root, yeah.
And the host.
And where's the next one? Which here, I'll pull up the line. Which line number?
CSS for 127.
Oh,
127.
yeah, host. There we go. Yeah, that looks familiar, right? Cool. Yeah, we actually got some style.text content. So they're creating a style element, document.create element style, and then style.text content and saying the content of that element. We might have passed in a whole string within HTML, right? Or use templates, but that's the same thing. We've seen that before. Shadow.appendChild style. All right. See what else we have. They have something called mover, which makes sense. We've all seen a marquee, right? It's like one of those little signs where the text moves across and then moves around. All right. So mover.appendChild. Ooh, what else do we see?
This.
Yep, we have this. That's true. So this here refers to what? The what?
Whatever's the current element.
Current.
Exactly, the instance of the element. Perfect. What else do we see before we see the first this? Line 133, what are we doing?
Create element.
Yeah.
What kind?
Content.
Content, exactly. What does that content do? It takes nodes, right, and reprojects them. Cool. We have some other callbacks here.
Detached callback.
Yep, so we have an attached callback. Mentioned we don't really do a lot of stuff here, but sort of true in this case as well. Yeah, I think they're actually calling start and stop. You want to see what those do? We'll get back to that. So let me just see what start does, because that seems to be a function. So they're attaching some methods to this element. We have start. Sort of makes sense here. So they're saying if continue, and player. They're doing request animation frame. We can go into the details on that later, but they're dealing with some animation here. I like the fix me comments. Really not that. Let's go back to attribute changed. There we go. Attribute changed. We've talked about that. They're using a switch case control statement there. How many of you have used switch cases? Yeah? Okay. So they're using a switch case, which makes sense, right? What are they switching on?
Different attributes.
Yeah, for like the names of the attributes, right? 'Cause remember these name, old value, new value? They have those set up here. They're switching on the name and the value, which makes sense, because they want to treat different values different ways. So here they're saying if they have things like BG color, because that's sort of like an old school way to do background color in a HTML element. I mean, marquee's old school, so you might as well go all the way if you do this. They have width. They have like direction. So this is a little bit more specific to the actual marquee behavior. So they're saying if the direction changes, they're going to stop. They're going to set loop count to 0, and they're going to start again. I'm guessing something there allows them to, probably in direction. So if we go to start, where we just saw this, see what they're doing with direction. Somewhere here they're setting direction. So they are actually doing some interesting things as well here in terms of setting direction. They have this handy method they've written called reflect attribute. Let's take a look at that. There we go. This is a little complicated here, but object.define property, a fancy way of setting a property on an object. So they're setting the property on their prototype object here. I'm setting a getter and a setter, and setting it enumerable on that particular defining direction or defining whatever they pass in here as a property here, because they have attributes and they want to reflect them as properties. Pretty sure that's what they're doing. All right, and then we have some other some inline event handlers. Let's see what's happening there. So define inline event handler. They're saying var property name equals on plus event name. So on, click, and then somewhere here they're taking that. They're creating handlers for those events. So what they've sort of done is they've noticed that there are certain functions they do over and over again, and have written sort of nice ways to reuse that functionality. All right, so they also have some of these other functions here. Get metrics, I don't know what that means, but get animation parameters. So we have some functions that are meant to be methods on this object. You notice we're setting them on the prototype because they're methods. We're setting different information about our height and width, our direction, behavior. Should continue by default. Loop should slide only once. Slide loops only once. Continue. Start. Stop. And then we're done. I mean, that's 426 lines of code for that element. This seems like a lot, but that's not actually, like, this is an element that's actually in the browser and used. Does anyone have any questions? So I just wanted to present this because I find it really interesting. I think we've talked all week about like this way that we can create our own elements, and that's cool. It's cool to know that like as developers we can create them. But I think sometimes when you get these APIs, you might think, well, this is only for us, like lowly developers. Like if I were building in the browser, I would do it a completely different way. You know, normally you'd probably do it, not in JavaScript in the browser. But I think it's really cool to see this implementation here and see how a method, how an element could be implemented, and how a lot of it is the same. A lot of it is what we've been doing all week. And actually take a look at this sometimes if I have questions about where I might put something in an element. Yeah.
This might be simplistic, but can I think of an element as like a superclass and a class like a mini class? Or is that just not even close?
You can think of it as a class. We have classes in JavaScript now, so I used to be able to say we don't have classes in JavaScript, but now we do in ES6. But, bracket that, these are essentially parent objects that our elements inherit from, so you can think of it that way. That's less of a question about elements and more of a question about like how do we do inheritance in JavaScript. And there's some really good articles in that. I don't have the time to dive into that, but there are some really good articles on that in particular.
Because I'm used to this referring to like objects and classes.
It's a similar concept, right? So in this case, for this, is referring to the instance, which is similar in a lot of languages, right? And in JavaScript, when we use that in a constructor, for example, it refers to the instance. Yeah, so I won't dwell on this, but I wanted to kind of call out, these aren't, things that only we're doing. This is actually an implementation in a browser. I find that really interesting, and we're doing the same thing. The other people are when they go in are tasked with creating an element. So that was the purpose of just going through that selection there. Let's see. This was the link to that source code, so you can take a look at that. And the exercise for this is to go ahead and implement the blink element as a web component. So how many of you use blink? Also, you don't have to, I see, you learned your lesson from Marquis. I'm actually not certain if blink is available in some browsers, or if it'll work in some browsers or not. Doesn't matter. Implement it, from the ground up. So create a custom element, call it something blink. Maybe add some attributes so that you can blink at a fast speed or a slow speed, and implement it as a custom element with Shadow DOM, with HTML templates, with HTML imports, and we're going to add this to our style guide components. Does that sound good?